And I said, I think this homeschooling might be our solution. What do you think? She said, well, I don't know much about homeschooling. I was an expert at this point. So I explained to her what it was. Uh,
Right.
and she said, she asked me a question. She said, well, what would your role in homeschooling be? And I hadn't really my role in homeschooling pretty well figured out. She
Yeah, right, right.
breakfast table every morning and prayer and Bible reading and then math and the whole thing. So
All the things, yeah.
Welcome to the Front Line with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the Front Line.
All right, well, today we have Mike Smith on as a guest to the podcast here, and I'm really grateful for that. Mike Smith was the president of HSLDA for many years, and before that, he was a founder of HSLDA, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But welcome, Mike. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Nathan, what a privilege to be with you. I really appreciate it.
Well, I wanted to kind of start out with just kind of talking about your history with HSLDA homeschooling and where all of this started. I know that it was before HSLDA started that you were involved in homeschooling, so you definitely predate that. But tell us about how you got started with this whole homeschooling thing and how did that all happen?
Nathan, in 1981, I heard a radio program, Dr. Dobson's Focus on the Family, that many people heard. What people don't realize about that, though, is Dr. Dobson had the Moores on starting in the 1980, I believe it was. He had them on many times, but I saw them in 1981. In 1981, we were searching for a school setting, the best school setting for our son, who was having some issues reading and, just staying, being in a classroom, quite frankly, kind of acting up and all of that stuff. So we were looking for maybe an alternative. I don't know that we were looking for it, but at any rate, we were concerned about it. And as I was
Sure.
traveling to court one day on the I-10 freeway, I was listening to Dr. Dobson. I was probably stopped in traffic, quite frankly. It was only 10 miles, but sometimes it took hours to get there.
Yeah.
I was listening to this program because I listened regularly to Focus on the Family, and he had Dr. Moore on there with his wife, Dorothy, both of them being PhDs in early childhood education. And he was sharing with them initially about the best age for school for children. And they had done some studies. As a matter of fact, they did a lot of studies on readiness for attending school. And they had concluded that the compulsory attendance ages in most states being 5, 6, and 7 were too early for all kids, but especially boys. They had determined through their research and all this that boys, on average, mature later than girls. So a lot of what you would see in the classroom with the boys acting out and maybe not being able to read as well, that sort of thing, didn't relate to their intelligence. It related to the maturity.
Mm.
So based on that, he had written 2 books, Better Late Than Early and School Can Wait. And that's what they were talking about. And then he went on and he said, now some of these parents are not only delaying their children's education, Nathan, but they liked it so much, they just decided to teach them at home. Well, I've never heard about teach them at home. Did anybody do that? Maybe back
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln, way back when,
Right.
in our history. But certainly in my history, I didn't know anything about homeschooling. I never heard of anybody that did it. I didn't know it existed. But you know what? As I listened more and more, it spoke right into my spirit that
Mm.
this could be a way that we could solve the issue we were dealing with our education and our kids. So I went home after court and I sat down with my wife. I remember sitting down at the breakfast table and saying, honey, I have something I'd like to share with you. I don't know how you're going to take this, but I've been listening to a radio program on homeschooling. Did you listen to it? Because she sometimes did. She said, no, I didn't. I didn't this morning. I said, well, they had some people on there that are talking about, I think they're talking about our son because it deals with boys and their maturity for education. And I said, I think this homeschooling might be our solution. What do you think? She said, well, I don't know much about homeschooling. So I was an expert at this point. So I explained to her what it was. Uh,
Right.
and she said, she asked me a question. She said, well, what would your role in homeschooling be? And I hadn't really thought my role in homeschooling pretty well figured out. She
Yeah, right.
breakfast table every morning and prayer and Bible reading and then math and the whole thing.
All
So
the things, yeah.
so I made some commitments. I unfortunately didn't keep them all, but anyway, I made some pretty strong commitments. But she told me one thing. She said, "I'd like to know more about this." And so she said, "Why don't you get a hold of Dr. Moore and talk to him? I'd like to talk to him." So I got a hold of him. He was in Michigan, Berrien Springs, Michigan, at that time at a Seventh Day Adventist school. And so when I got a hold of him, he said, well, look, this is perfect timing. Next weekend, we're going to be in Auburn, California, and we're putting on a homeschool conference. Why don't you guys come up? And I said, well, are we free? My wife said, sure. So we went to our first homeschool conference, took the kids, and we had a good time up there. And we heard about homeschooling in detail. And my wife said, I think this is something that I could do. We'll start out 1 year at a time and see.
Wow.
And so we did. And 1 year became two. And so she graduated. We had 4 children at that time. Our oldest, however, was in senior high school. So she started with a 10th grader, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old. Now, she didn't do much with the 5 and 3-year-old, but she really got into teaching our 10th grader, who loved it because she called it homeschool tech. And all of her friends, when she left school and started all of her friends wanted to be homeschooled. They didn't like school. They were tired of school. They were burned out on high school. So that's how we got started, Nathan. And that got me then into the homeschool move. Who is that young fella?
This is William.
William,
Say hi,
how
Will.
today? Boy, you are good looking. Wow. Boy, you're going to break some hearts down the road. I can tell you.
Yep, he's helping out today.
Not today, though. Yeah, so that's how we got started. And then, of course, we got into defending families, and I will go into that. So when we started, I didn't bother to look at the law, Nathan, to see whether this was legal or not. I just assumed something this good, it wouldn't be a problem.
It had to be legal, right? Yeah, so you just jumped right in.
Think about it. Okay. So then we hadn't been homeschooling very long. I guess my wife met some homeschool moms. There weren't many homeschooling. We were living in Santa Monica, California at the time. And she met some homeschool moms and got connected that way. And the next thing I know, I got a phone call from Dovey Clopton, was her name, Dovey Clopton. And she was living in Lancaster, California. And she had seen an interview. She was trying to homeschool. She had seen an interview in the Los Angeles Times that I did on homeschooling. And honestly, I did so poorly trying to explain, homeschooling and the legality of homeschooling and that sort of thing. I thought, would anybody ever homeschool after they read this? But she didn't see any negatives to it. I mean, it was a very negative article because obviously they went way beyond what I said, and they spelled out how it's illegal to homeschool in California unless you were a certified teacher. Okay.
Okay.
So Dovey Clopton moved from Arkansas to Lancaster, California. She had 3 children, and she enrolled them in the public school, and her kindergarten daughter was sitting at the lunch room in the cafeteria, and she prayed over her food. And the kids started pointing to her and said, you can't do that, you can't do that. And anyway, sure enough, the monitor came over there, teacher monitor said, no, you can't pray here in school. So the little girl was crushed. She went home. She was crying. Mommy, you won't believe it. They wouldn't let me pray over my food down there at school. Debbie
Wow.
got mad. And
Yeah.
she went down there and she went to that principal that you got to do something about that woman. This can't be right. But you saying that my daughter can't even pray over her food? No, that's the law. Sorry. Sorry, Miss Clopton. That's the way it is. She said, well, you're not going to see my kids in school here ever. And she just jerked them out. She didn't, what am I going to do? She couldn't, there were
Right.
private schools she could afford or anything. What am I going to do? So she started homeschooling and immediately they went after her. And so she had been giving a notice to appear at a district attorney hearing in Lancaster. And she called me, can you help me? And I said, I'll have to, I'm going to have to figure this out. So I said, I will try, I'll help you. I'll try to help you. So I went with her. And in the process between that time she called me and going to her hearing, I looked up the law, figured it out, and unfortunately in California, there were a couple of cases that actually reinforced the statute that said, the tutorial provision in California. And in order to tutor a child in California, you had to be teacher certified. And you had to be certified in the area that you were teaching. So obviously, Debbie she wasn't certified, but neither was my wife. So now I'm facing this. And as a lawyer, I take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the state of California. So I'm now a lawbreaker. So I had to find a way that this could be legal. And there were two different thoughts that I had just doing the research on it. Number one, constitutionally, this could not be right. And so we had the Pierce case in Oregon that says that parents, the children are not a mere creature of the state. And Oregon had actually required all children to attend public school. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Oregon lost. That's the first parental rights case really the Supreme Court addressed. And so we argued that Pierce would give parents the authority to teach their children. They don't have to be educated in a public school. They can be educated in a private school, and we'd argue in a homeschool. And looking at the homeschool, looking at the compulsory attendance law in California, and this is all familiar to you now, but looking at it, we could see that there was a private school exemption that could possibly apply to homeschooling. And so I argued constitutionally they couldn't require her to have her kids in school. And I pointed out the statute to the district attorney at the hearing. I also had her bring in all of her books. By this time, she had a ton of books. She brought some books. They didn't even want to see. The superintendent was there, or the principal was there, and he said, I'm not interested in her book. She just can't homeschool. I said, you're not interested whether the kids are getting a decent education. Isn't that what we're about?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, look, she has to comply with the law. Now, I was assuming at that point we'd end up in court. That was my first case. But I provided them with about 12 or 15 pages of memorandum on the law and argument. I don't know if that had any effect or not, but they didn't file on Debbie. They left her alone. Debbie
Wow.
Clopton homeschooled her kids, and that really started the whole adventure in California of defending families. And of course, it goes on and on and on from there. But that was
Right.
the first case.
So that was around what year then? 82, 83?
1982, I believe it was.
Okay.
It was 1981 or 1982. I had just got started myself.
Yeah. So you had been an attorney for a while in Southern California.
Oh yeah,
doing other things.
Practicing in 1972.
Okay. Okay. And so and what was your normal kind of case that you took before that? Because you didn't start out as a homeschool attorney.
No, but the good news was I started out as a prosecutor, and
Okay.
I
Okay.
prosecuted for 2 years, and so then I became a defense attorney. So I did a lot of criminal defense. So
Okay.
I understood all these issues. I had not.
Right.
The only constitutional case I'd ever argued really was a statutory case. It involved Culver City, California had an ordinance prohibiting folks from carrying guns, but it was more restrictive than the state law. So I used the preemption doctrine. That is, that the state had preempted the field as it related to regulation of guns in California. That was that was the only constitutional argument I'd ever made prior to that, except using the Fourth Amendment, of course, unreasonable searches and seizures, but that's pretty narrow. But obviously, I knew my way in and around the courts. I understood how to argue cases, how to brief cases, how to try cases, because
Yeah.
I tried a lot of cases in the city attorney's office. So the other thing I was doing was personal injury work, but so I was positioned to be able to
Yeah.
defend families.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. God gave you a lot of different
I've done
experiences.
a couple juvenile court cases as well, so I understood juvenile court real well. So I was there. I just had to figure out how to make the argument in California, and that's the arguments we made. The
Right.
constitutional and statutory, and eventually the statutory carried the day, as you know.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It took a while to get all of those things, developed, and then there were still challenges.
Long time,
So,
it's still challenging. Yeah.
yeah. So, so you were defending homeschooling cases before you even started HSLDA with Mike Ferris. How did that
That's
come
what.
about?
Well, that's what happened. I met Mike. Um, I'd already done the Debbie Clopton case, and I met Mike, and he was telling me about the same problem he was having in Washington State. Washington State was taking the same position regarding homeschoolers. You had to be a certified teacher. So he was defending families constitutionally. He didn't really have a statutory argument in Washington State like we.
Okay.
And that was the background. The two of us met, and we'd already been involved in defending families in Washington State and California. So that's how we met. That was our commonality. That was our common bond when we met each other.
Okay. And you met each other at a homeschool conference in Sacramento?
Yeah, we did. I think it was the
Okay.
Chia. I think it was the Chia conference.
Okay.
I,
Okay.
I'm a little bit fuzzy on that, Nathan, but it
Yeah.
definitely was in Sacramento, and it definitely was about homeschooling.
And then you guys just started HSLDA on the back of a napkin, so to speak, right?
Well, Mike had already. I think he had already prepared the corporate filing. He hadn't filed.
Okay.
He had not filed it. He was looking for somebody to join him in filing these documents as because you have to have more than one incorporator. And so it
Right.
ended up being, as a matter of fact, in Washington State, you needed more than two. So we had four: Mike and his wife Vicky, and Mike Smith and his wife Elizabeth. We were the initial incorporators of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We were the initial board of directors.
Wow.
March
And
1983, Nathan.
that's pretty incredible. And HSLDA has certainly gone on to do a lot of incredibly important things for the homeschool community, both in California and across the nation and even around the world now. Um, what would you say are some of the highlights over your years there?
The highlight would be the long-term battle to legalize homeschooling. And Nathan, as you know, every state recognizes a legal way to homeschool. Some of them are more difficult to comply with than others. The most difficult states are Pennsylvania and New York. But we have some states, 5 or 6 states, where homeschoolers don't even give notice, like we do in California with the filing our affidavit. So the law varies from very unregulated to very regulated and everything in between. But in every state in the United States of America, you have a right to homeschool. That's the biggest that's the biggest achievement that HSLDA has. And honestly, uh, we couldn't have done it. There were two factors, two partners that we had: God, who blessed our efforts. It was obvious through some miraculous stuff that happened,
Hmm.
and through our partners through the state associations like CHIA and Family Protection Ministry. As you know, it takes two to tango. We have to have somebody in that state that knows that legislature. Now, we have a lot of members and we can put pressure on the legislature. We do it ourselves through lobbying, but we have to have a partnership. Family Protection Ministries was our best partner throughout my time at HSLDA.
Wow. And you were involved in, if I remember right, in working on legislation in California before and during Family Protection Ministries sort of starting up, right? And
Well,
could you?
we had thought about maybe, Nathan, we'd thought about trying to get legislation, but we decided we never felt that we could get what we wanted that would be better than the private school exemption through the legislature. And I think that's still the case, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, we have a tremendous statute in California, and it's been um, really used successfully to defend cases, but it's also been it's gone up to the appellate court level, and that, yeah, that's its own story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And so you asked me about the things that I'm pleased with. One of those would be in 2008, and Nathan, you were involved in this in 2008, the Jonathan L. case in Los Angeles, California, correct?
Yes,
You were working with Family Protection at that time, were you not?
yes. I had started about 6 years earlier. Yeah.
Yes, you had. So tell the folks out there what you remember about this case. And I'll fill in
Well,
we did what you did.
if I remember right, the case was in the juvenile court system, so people didn't know what was going on with this case initially. It was a juvenile case related to some kids, but when it got to the court, they were arguing whether they were a lower court. I think it was, I don't know, the juvenile court had decided
Yeah,
that
let me just
homeschooling
clarify
was,
that. That's right.
yeah,
So this was a homeschool family, but they were not taken to juvenile court because of homeschooling or neglect because of that. They were charged with being abusive of their children and neglecting their children. In the process of that, homeschooling came up because they were appointed, a court appointed attorneys, and it turned out these were a child's rights group advocates. And so that child's right attorney group argued that not only were the families abusive to the children, but that homeschooling, that the children had to be protected from homeschooling because nobody was able to monitor them as to how they were doing with their education, nor how the family was doing in terms of abusing or neglecting their children. That's how homeschooling got involved in that case. It wasn't initially about homeschooling. And so that was in the juvenile court setting. So what they had argued is for the juvenile court judge to terminate their right to homeschool. The judge, based on constitutional arguments that were made on behalf of an attorney on behalf of the family, he denied that. So they appealed to the fourth district, which is Los Angeles primarily. And on that appeal, as you recall, Nathan, they won. The judge
right.
ruled, the three-judge panel ruled homeschooling to be illegal except for the tutorial exemption. And nobody knew this case was going through the system. Nobody. We
Right.
didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. So the next thing we know, we get a report from some. Did you know that homeschooling is now illegal? And what? What? What are you talking?
Yeah,
That can't be the case.
all of
Oh,
a
it
sudden,
was.
yeah.
It was. And so we got involved. You got involved. A lot of people got involved. But how we actually got involved was the attorney that they hired. They weren't happy with their other lawyer. The attorney they hired to represent them on appeal was somebody we worked with in California. And he knew that we knew homeschooling better than he did. So he associated us. But they didn't want us involved for some reason. I'm not sure what happened there. So we kind of had to do this. We had to write the briefs for him to sign and file. And so what we did is we filed a motion on their behalf for a reconsideration of their ruling. You have 15 days from the date. This was in February. You have 15 days from the date. We got this the 10th day. We got 5 days to do this. Okay? So we turned it around in our office here. He got it filed, and the court did something amazing. Probably less than 5% of motions to reconsideration are granted. They granted it. And in the
Wow.
process of granting it, they recognized that they were involved in a very hotly contested issue in California. Okay.
Right.
And so they wanted to know. And so they asked all these people, anybody that wanted to file a friend of the court brief could do so. And there were 15 of them filed, and you guys filed one, right?
Right. Yeah.
Family protection. How'd that go down?
Well, ultimately they
Were you-
reversed
Yeah.
their decision.
Did you partner with Chia in filing your brief? Do you remember?
We did. There was us and Chia, and there was one other organization. Yeah, because there were a whole bunch of briefs filed for that case.
Yes, 15.
That was incredible.
15
That's
briefs.
pretty unusual number, isn't it?
Remember I said our partnership with God in
Yep.
protecting homeschool. Here's our miracle. Schwarzenegger was the governor. He filed a brief in support of homeschooling. Jerry Brown was the attorney general. Guess what? He filed a brief in support of homeschooling. Los Angeles Unified School District, where these kids would have attended, they filed a brief in support. So there were some amazing briefs that were filed from people that I mean, totally out of the blue, that completely surprised us. But there were a lot of other conservative groups that filed briefs as well. So as far as the briefing was concerned, it was strongly on the side of recognizing homeschooling through the private school exemption. But at the oral argument, Mike Ferris argued for HSLDA, and he came back. He was very depressed. He said, "We're not going to win this. We're going to have to take this to this California Supreme Court. Chances, a fat chance there, right?" So
Yeah.
But in August, we waited about 4 months. In August, the ruling came down. And what was it, Nathan?
It was 100% for homeschooling. I think it was
Three judges reversed themselves.
the same judges. Yeah.
Same judges reversed themselves completely, found homeschooling to be appropriate under or legal under the private school exemption, and went further to say that the school district didn't have any authority, nor did the State Department of Education, over these home schools because they're private schools. They couldn't regulate them other than what was in the statute, which is the requirements as it applies to the affidavit filing once a year. That was amazing too. And if you don't like this, you have to go to the legislature.
Right.
That was 2008. 2008. So from 2008, we've got a court opinion in California that says homeschooling is legal via the private school exemption.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.